In the southern veins of Chicago, where the streets cracked like old bones and the air was thick with gasoline, rot, and burnt grease, South Haven had long been a forgotten limb of the city's body. Buildings slouched like drunks, graffiti bloomed in neon curses on the walls, and police cruisers glided through like sharks, never stopping, never staying longer than they had to. It was here that Jeremiah J. Coleman returned after 15 years behind bars, carrying nothing but the weight of regret and a name that no longer belonged to him. Jay hadn't come back seeking redemption. There were no dreams of greatness in his chest. The system hadn't broken him. He'd done that to himself a long time ago. What brought him back was quieter, heavier, family, a son, a promise he hadn't made out loud but kept alive all those years behind steel and stone. Corey, his teenage son, barely remembered him. The boy lived with Jay's sister now, a woman hardened by life, bitter from losses too sharp to speak of. Corey's mother had overdosed 5 years ago, leaving the boy bouncing between shelters, group homes, and alleyways. He'd inherited the neighborhood's armor, silence, suspicion, and a stare that didn't flinch. Jay moved into a crumbling apartment above an abandoned laundromat. Every night the pipes howled like ghosts. The floor sagged beneath his boots. The city outside muttered in broken glass and sirens. He took a job hauling bags of cement on a downtown construction site, trading pain for cash under a foreman who spat more insults than words. He came home sore, dirty, and hoping, always hoping, that Corey would be there, waiting, ready to talk. But the boy came and went like smoke, never lingering long. The spring heat in South Haven was the kind that didn't care what month it was. It pressed against the city like a warning. Poverty, neglect, and anger grew in the concrete like weeds, bursting through cracks no one bothered to patch. Jay could feel it, the slow pulse of desperation humming under every surface. He'd once been part of that rhythm, back in the days of stolen cars, petty hustles, and the one job that had ended everything. A botched robbery, a jewelry store, a shot fired too soon, prison. Now temptation came dressed in an old face. Randy Banks. He'd been Jay's partner once, part conman, part magician, always with a grin that smelled of trouble. Now Randy ran a chop shop dressed up as a legit garage. When they met again in a mildew-stained bar at the edge of the neighborhood, Jay barely recognized him. Expensive jacket, gold chain, the confidence of a man who hadn't been caught yet. Randy didn't waste time. He had a side hustle in mind. One too good to turn down, he said. A metals warehouse on Industrial Road, unguarded, underdocumented, filled with millions in copper and silver. Jay listened, and then he said no. He thought of Corey, of the boy's eyes when they met across the prison glass years ago, afraid, unsure, smaller than he remembered. That memory clung to him like rust. But South Haven wasn't done yet. The next morning, the city caught fire, not with flames, not yet, but with fury. Across town, a white cop shot an unarmed black teenager. Word traveled faster than the sirens. On every block, every stoop, people leaned in, whispered, grew louder, angrier. By nightfall, windows were shattering, stores were looted, cars burned. The city's bones cracked louder. Jay came home early and found Corey gone. At first, he thought the kid was out with friends. But when he looked outside and saw the crowd swelling, masks on faces, bricks in hands, rage in every motion, his heart stopped. He hit the street running, dodging past locked doors and peeking eyes. He found Corey in a crowd, arm cocked, a rock ready in his fist, aimed at a pharmacy's glass front. Jay grabbed him just in time. The boy struggled, shouting, burning. Jay held tight. Together they walked home through a city unraveling, sirens howling, fists pounding on hoods, mothers shielding children from the smoke. South Haven wasn't waiting anymore. That night, the streets overflowed. Protesters, looters, opportunists, people like Randy, who saw chaos not as danger but as profit. Jay tried to serve dinner. Corey stared at the table like it was a grave. Then came the knock. Randy again, this time eyes gleaming, breath quick. He had a plan. While the city burned, they'd slip into the warehouse. No guards, no cameras. One night's work. A lifetime of reward. Jay hesitated. The fridge was nearly empty. Rent was overdue. The foreman at the site had already made it clear he wouldn't last much longer. He asked for time to think. When Randy left, Corey didn't say a word. But his silence spoke louder than anything Jay had heard in years. The boy knew. And in that knowing, Jay saw something that terrified him more than prison ever had: understanding. Outside, the city screamed, and time was running out. The city hadn't yet opened its eyes when Jay stepped into the morning haze, the air already bitter with smoke and tension, and the streets of South Haven groaned beneath the weight of broken glass and unresolved anger as he moved like a ghost through the wreckage of a familiar neighborhood now hollowed out by time and violence, his boots crunching the remnants of someone else's fight, someone else's fire, someone else's failure, and all around him, buildings slouched against each other as if bracing for the next blow. Windows sealed with plywood crosses, alleys stuffed with the ashes of old couches and burnt-out trash cans, and even the shadows seemed too exhausted to stretch. But Jay walked on, following the only thread left in the unraveling fabric of his life, toward the meeting spot where his past waited with open arms and silent teeth. And when he reached the old gas station at the district's edge, where rust devoured signage and weeds choked the pavement, Randy was already there, with that same predator calm in his eyes, leaning against a dented van that smelled like gasoline and old sins, flanked by two new faces who didn't need introductions because men like that didn't carry names, just reputations and pit, thin, sharp, twitching, paced like his bones itched beneath his skin, while Jose sat still as a mountain, a shotgun laid across his lap and a stare that had seen enough not to blink, and they looked at Jay like he was another tool in the kit, something to use until it broke or betrayed. And maybe he was. Maybe that's all he'd ever been, so he climbed in without a word. The engine grumbled to life, and they drove through a city that no longer pretended to be whole, where each corner whispered warnings and every corner store shuttered itself against the morning. And the plan was stupid in its simplicity, as if the very chaos of the riots would protect them. No guards, no cameras, no eyes where the fire was hottest. And by the time they reached the edge of Industrial Road, the sun was clawing its way over the rooftops like it, too, was trying to escape. And the warehouse squatted there, unbothered, wrapped in rusted fencing and silence, its rear gate bending under the crowbar with a sound like bones giving in. And they moved quickly, sliding through the opening and disappearing into the metal lungs of the building, where shelves loomed like cathedral walls, and coils of copper glinted in the low light like sacred offerings, and it should have felt triumphant. It should have tasted like payback or victory, but it didn't. It felt wrong, quiet in a way that screamed louder than any alarm. But they pressed on, driven by hunger or habit or the sheer momentum of bad choices, and Randy led them to a locked chamber, chains thick and brittle with time, and Pitt's fingers danced across the lock like a musician playing a bitter tune, until it clicked, and the doors swung open to reveal row upon row of silver-packed crates that shimmered like a promise someone had once made, and they started moving. Boxes to carts, carts to van, like an old machine humming again for the first time in years, their breath ragged and skin-soaked, and Jay moved with them but not among them. one hand gripping a crate, the other gripping a question he couldn't shake. And then he saw Corey, through the grime-covered glass of the office, a shadow with his son's eyes, standing silent and still, watching it all, watching him. And the world cracked at the edges because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Not again. Not with him standing there like a ghost of everything Jay had tried to bury. And before he could move, before he could call out or run or break apart, the warehouse came alive with sound, a high-pitched scream that wasn't human. The alarm triggered, maybe by one of those kids they'd scared off, maybe by fate itself. But it didn't matter, because panic detonated in the room like a flashbang. Randy shouting, Pitt dropping tools, Jose raising the shotgun toward the boy he didn't trust. And Jay moved like instinct, grabbing Corey, pulling him close, dragging him toward the exit as the van roared to life and tore through the gate in a storm of noise and steel. And they ducked into the alley, hearts pounding, the world boiling around them as the riot above became a war zone below. And the van screamed down cracked asphalt while they crawled through back streets, choking on ash, while sirens howled from every direction and helicopters carved the sky into pieces. And Jay knew then they were alone again, outgunned and outnumbered. And if they didn't disappear soon, they'd become just another burned body in a city that no longer counted its dead. So he led Corey through ruined lots, ducking under fire escapes, dodging mobs that weren't sure if they were protesting or just hungry for destruction. And finally, breathless and shaking, they collapsed inside the abandoned laundromat, the same one Jay had called home, the same one where the floor creaked with ghosts. And there, in the dark, he tried to think, tried to piece together a way out. And that's when he heard it. The static hiss of the walkie-talkie left in the duffel, and Randy's voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, full of greed and arrogance, naming the place where they'd dump the silver. El Dorado, Harper Road, and Jay went cold, because he knew that place. Knew it in the way old criminals know the difference between a setup and salvation. A burned-out nightclub with a basement that ate people and floors too rotten to carry hope. And he knew this too. If Corey saw that place, if they knew the boy had been there, had watched them unload their sin, they wouldn't let him walk away. And Jay couldn't let that happen, couldn't bury another part of himself, so they moved again, back into the fire, not away from it, because the only way to beat the storm was to walk into its center and tear out its heart before it beat again. The city wasn't breathing anymore. It was gasping, choking on its own smoke and screams as Jay and Corey slipped through the alleys of South Haven like shadows with purpose. Every corner a new gamble, every echo a possible death knell. The streets now battlegrounds where ideology had been replaced by instinct and rage, and there were no sides anymore. Only survivors and casualties, and Jay knew, with a certainty born from years behind bars and the blood-slick floors of bad decisions, that time was fracturing around them, collapsing like rotted beams under too much pressure, and they didn't have the luxury of strategy or backup, only motion, only grit, only that primal urgency to outrun the past while dragging what little future they had left behind them. And every second Corey was near him. Every time Jay looked at the boy's face smeared with ash and fear, he felt the weight press harder against his chest. Not fear for himself. Never that, but fear that the fire might reach his son first, might touch him in the way it once touched Jay. Permanently, unforgivably, like a brand burned into bone. And as they turned the corner near the collapsed overpass, a sudden roar of engines split the air. Not the controlled hum of cruisers, but the animal growl of the van, Randy's van, streaking down the avenue with its rear doors barely closed. Metal crates trembling inside like caged prey, and Jay grabbed Corey, pulling him behind a scorched dumpster as the van thundered past. And just for a moment, just a flicker of time that tasted like gunpowder and sweat, Jay caught Randy's eyes behind the wheel, wide, electric, filled with the terrible clarity of someone who believed they might actually win this. And then it was gone, swallowed by smoke and distance. But Jay had seen enough to know that Randy wasn't done, not even close, because men like him didn't stop until they either held the crown or lay in the gutter clutching the shards, and Jay couldn't afford either outcome, not with Corey watching, not with the streets hissing like snakes and cops sweeping the district in waves of boots and sirens. And so they ran again, feet slamming the pavement in rhythm with the city falling to pieces, until they reached the gutted remains of what used to be South Haven High, now just bones and graffiti and shattered lockers full of scorched dreams. And there Jay stopped, listening, feeling, deciding, and that's when the plan formed. Not perfect, not safe, but real. And it wrapped itself around him like armor made of desperation and love, because if Randy was headed to El Dorado, if he was really going to stash the silver there, then Jay had one chance to intercept, to end this before it pulled them even deeper into the fire. So he turned to Corey, grabbed the boy by the shoulders, looked into his eyes and told him what needed to be done. Not with words, but with that raw, silent language fathers pass to sons when there is no time left for stories, only truth. And Corey nodded, slow and steady, like he understood the weight, like he was already carrying it, and together they made their way across the broken district, climbing fences, crossing through burned-out apartments where families used to live and ghosts now lingered, until they reached the edge of Harper Road, and there it was, crouched in the dark like a waiting beast, the El Dorado Club, forgotten by most, but not by Jay, never by Jay, because that place had history, soaked in blood and music and deals made with eyes wide open, and as they slipped into the shadows of its outer walls, the sound of tires crunching gravel reached them, and then headlights like twin daggers pierced the smoke, and the van crept forward, slow now, cautious, as if it too felt the trap tightening around its axles. And Jay pushed Corey back, told him to wait, then moved low, quick, feral, heart hammering like a war drum. Because this was it. This was the moment that would crack their lives open, one way or another, and he couldn't let Corey see the worst of it. Not yet. Not if he could help it. So he watched from the wreckage of an old Buick as Randy stepped out, his face a twisted mix of triumph and calculation, barking orders to Nails and Jose, who stumbled out after him, pale with adrenaline, their hands already on crates, already moving, and Jay felt it rising in him, that old pulse, the thing he'd buried, the part of himself that knew how to end things violently, decisively, and he welcomed it now, not because he wanted to, but because some devils only answer to one voice, and his was screaming. And then he moved, silent and brutal, closing the distance like a thunderclap in human form. There was no pause, no breath left to catch, no space between footsteps anymore as Jay hurled himself through the broken lot of the El Dorado, the club looming above him like a derelict cathedral, with its rusted sign flickering half-dead letters that once promised glamour, but now whispered ruin. And every part of this place reeked of memory and menace, each brick soaked in history, too heavy to carry, but impossible to ignore. And as he moved closer to the rear entrance where Randy's crew had begun unloading the stolen silver, he could feel the temperature of the night shift, not just in the heat still radiating off the concrete, but in the way the shadows moved differently now. Slower, meaner, like the building itself had joined the hunt. And from the cover of a fallen neon fixture, Jay watched as Nails dragged one crate after another into the gaping mouth of the club, his silhouette jerky and unsure, like a man already picturing betrayal, while Jose scanned the darkness with the shotgun gripped too tight, the barrel shaking with a nervous rhythm that betrayed the calm his wide shoulders tried to project. And then there was Randy, moving with that oily confidence, his voice slicing the air, commanding, mocking, already spending the money in his head, already building castles from the silver now clinking against concrete. And Jay felt it. The shift. The moment when planning ends and instinct begins. When the part of you trained for violence takes over because words are no longer part of the conversation. And he tightened his grip on the rusted rebar he'd pulled from a pile of debris near the back fence. His breath steady now, like the city had paused its collapse just long enough to watch this final act unfold. And then he moved, low and fast. A shadow with weight and fury, closing the distance to the rear guards before either of them could so much as blink. The first blow catching one man across the temple with a crack like dry bone, sending him spinning to the ground without a sound, and the second guard turned just in time to catch Jay's shoulder in his gut, the air blasting out of him as they crashed to the pavement, fists and elbows and knees in a blur of survival and blood. And Jay didn't think, didn't stop, just moved and struck and twisted until the man stopped fighting back. And by the time Randy noticed, by the time his shout pierced the humid night, Jay was already inside the El Dorado, the rebar clenched in his fist, dripping rust and something darker, the smell of sweat and silver and betrayal thick enough to chew, and the interior of the club looked like a mausoleum. Long abandoned tables upended like gravestones, mold climbing the walls like ivy, the bar split in half from some long-forgotten riot, and under the cracked disco ball that now hung by a single wire, Randy stared at Jay like he'd seen a ghost, his smug grin faltering for just a second before twisting into something uglier, something sharp. And then came the gunfire, short bursts from Jose who'd taken cover behind the crate stack, the muzzle flashes lighting up the club in staccato images of chaos and ruin, and Jay dove behind a collapsed speaker tower, the bullets stitching holes in the floor where his legs had just been. And he knew it wouldn't take long, not with the noise, not in a city already on edge, and he had seconds, maybe less, to do something that mattered. So he moved again, using the wreckage as cover, closing in on Randy, who'd drawn his pistol and was barking orders that no one was listening to. And Jay could see it. He could see the moment when control slipped from Randy's hands and fear took its place, could see how the promise of wealth was cracking beneath the weight of reality. And just as Jose shouted a warning, just as Nails dropped the crate and backed away like a rat sensing a sinking ship, Jay lunged forward and tackled Randy to the ground, the gun skittering across the floor and disappearing beneath the bar, and fists followed, 1, 2, 3, sharp, desperate punches that spoke of years lost and futures stolen, until Randy's nose broke and his voice turned to choking gasps. But before Jay could finish it, before he could end what should have ended years ago, Jose was there, dragging him off, the shotgun raised, and Jay braced for the blast, ready to shield himself with nothing but memory and will. But it didn't come. Not because Jose had mercy, but because the door exploded open, and floodlights poured in like judgment, and cops stormed the room with shouts and rifles, a wave of black uniforms and barking orders crashing through the club, and everything froze. Hands lifted, eyes wide, the stolen silver forgotten on the floor, as boots stomped through puddles of spilled blood and broken promises. And Jay rose slowly, Corey's face flashing through his mind, steadying him, reminding him why he'd come here at all. And when the cuffs clicked around his wrists, when the cop yanked him back toward the light and away from the mess he'd made, he didn't fight, didn't speak, only searched the shadows for his son. And there, just beyond the broken door, partially hidden behind a car frame, was Corey, watching, unmoving, his eyes huge and haunted. And Jay met them one last time, nodding once, low and sure. A silent message through the fire, a promise that even now, even here, even shackled and bleeding and surrounded, he hadn't failed. Not completely, not yet. They dragged him through the haze like another piece of evidence, arms bound behind his back, the floor beneath his boots slick with ash and oil, the lights from the cruisers painting the world in pulses of red and blue that made everything look like a memory in the process of fading. And Jay didn't resist, didn't speak, just watched the blur of motion around him, the blur that was now his life. Officers shouting into radios, uniformed silhouettes shoving past each other, sirens still crying like newborns abandoned in the dark, and he let them move him, guide him, lock him away, because his fight for now was over, not lost, not surrendered, just shelved like a knife in the drawer, waiting, and as they pushed him into the back of the armored van, the door slammed shut with a sound that echoed louder than any gunshot, louder than Randy's curses as they cuffed him face down in the dirt, louder than Jose's moans as medics worked over his bleeding gut. And in that sudden heavy silence, Jay sat still, the metal bench cold against his spine, the cuffs digging into old scars, and he didn't think of justice or prison or escape. He thought only of Corey, of that last glance through the smoke, of those eyes wide with understanding too big for someone so young. And he prayed, not to a god, not anymore, but to the boy's instincts, that they would carry him now, guide him through the wreckage and rage, and outside the city groaned like a dying animal. Fires still licking the edges of South Haven, looters still darting between alleyways like nervous fish, and somewhere, not far enough away, the people who had nothing were still clawing at the walls of a world that never intended to let them in, and then the van stopped. Too soon, too sudden, and something was wrong. Voices outside rising in pitch, the click of guns being drawn, the smell of gasoline bleeding into the air, and Jay leaned forward, pressing his ear to the wall, his gut twisting because that smell, that tension, that silence before something catastrophic, it was all too familiar. And then came the explosion, small but close, a pop that shook the van and sent heat licking through the seams, and suddenly the shouting turned to screaming. The officers outside scrambling, someone yelling about a Molotov, about a blockade ahead, and Jay shifted, leaned back, calculated. And when the door burst open and smoke poured in, he acted, ducking low as chaos swallowed the street, the flames giving him cover. The panicked cops, too, focused on the fire to notice one prisoner slipping out the side, still cuffed but moving, always moving, through the haze and into the side streets, lungs burning, legs screaming, but alive, still alive, and South Haven opened to him like a wound, ready to bleed him again. But he didn't stop, didn't slow, until the van was gone behind him and the sirens faded, and only then did he collapse behind a dumpster, wrists raw, chest heaving, and for a long moment all he could do was lie there, eyes closed, trying to remember what hope felt like. And then he heard it. A familiar voice, low and rough, like gravel beneath boots. And when he looked up, he saw him, Barry Ship Thompson, the old street general who'd survived more wars than anyone could count, standing like a monument in a world of ruins, his gaze flat and unreadable. And without a word, Barry pulled him to his feet, snapped the cuffs with a pair of bolt cutters, and led him into the shadows, into the back of a garage that reeked of rubber and time. And there Jay sat while Barry poured 2 drinks, handed him one, and only then spoke, just a single sentence asking what he needed. And Jay answered without hesitation, "Corey, I need to find my boy." And Barry nodded, because for men like them, there were no gods, no saints, only the codes they built from pain and principle. And the only thing that ever truly mattered was who you stood up for when the world told you to stay down. So Barry handed him a change of clothes, a mechanic's cap, a fake badge, and the promise of one last ride. And by nightfall, Jay was back on the streets, stitched into a new skin, slipping through the cracks like smoke. asking questions, trading favors, listening for the one name that mattered in the screaming din of a city on fire. And eventually he found it. Whispers of a boy seen slipping through the East End, ducking patrols, avoiding gangs, alone but alive. And Jay followed those whispers like breadcrumbs through hell, through rooftops and sewers and the skeletons of buildings he once called home. Until finally, at the edge of a looted convenience store, in the shell of what used to be someone's kitchen, he heard it. A whistle, low and sharp, rising and falling in a pattern only two people knew, and his heart seized, his feet moving before his mind could catch up. And then, there in the doorway, framed by firelight, stood Corey, thinner, dirtier, but whole, and for a moment neither spoke, neither moved, just stared, father and son reuniting in the middle of the end of the world, and then they ran, not toward safety, not toward redemption, but toward each other, toward the next battle, there was no time for relief, no moment to savor reunion, because the city around them was still devouring itself, still grinding innocence into dust beneath boots and bullet casings. And, as Jay pulled Corey into a side alley, shielding the boy from the shriek of distant sirens and the sick yellow pulse of firelight, he felt the weight of fatherhood not as love, but as burden, sacred and brutal. The kind that presses down with every breath because to fail now was to lose everything. And the boy, this boy, his boy, was watching him not with fear or awe but with a quiet, growing steel in his eyes, the kind of hardness that only comes when a child stops expecting the world to be fair and starts preparing to survive it. And Jay didn't speak because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been burned into Corey's bones by the past week, the past year, the past life they were trying to crawl out of like rats from a flooded basement. And so they moved together through the mouth of the storm, ducking under sagging fences and crawling through the back ends of burned storefronts, avoiding the bright flares of police checkpoints and the slow, mindless drift of looters scavenging through what little was left to steal, and all around them South Haven screamed, not with voices but with sirens and fire alarms and the hollow thunder of collapsing roofs, and Jay knew the city wasn't just dying, it was killing itself, tearing its guts out for the world to see. And maybe that was what it had wanted all along. Maybe it had always been a ticking thing, waiting for the excuse to split wide open and drag everyone inside with it. But Jay didn't care anymore. Not about the why or the how or the justice behind the flames, only about the path forward. And that path led north, away from the heat and into the outer neighborhoods, where the fire hadn't yet touched the houses, and the streets still looked like something out of an old dream. And Barry had marked a place on a map, an old commuter tunnel beneath the elevated rail line, long since sealed off but still usable if you knew where to look, and Jay knew where to look, so he led Corey through the underbelly of the city, their footsteps echoing off concrete and rust, every breath louder than the last, every sound a potential enemy. And when they reached the tunnel entrance, half buried beneath debris and chain link, they didn't hesitate, didn't pause to listen, just slipped inside like ghosts, swallowed by the dark. And for a while they moved blind, guided only by instinct and memory, the air thick with the stench of wet steel and mildew, and Jay could feel Corey behind him, close but silent. And that silence said more than words ever could, said that the boy wasn't afraid anymore. Or maybe he was, but he'd learned how to carry it, how to move with it instead of through it. And Jay hated that, hated what the city had done to his son, but he also knew it might be the only reason the boy was still alive. And eventually the tunnel opened into a chamber where the roof had half collapsed, letting in just enough moonlight to see the path ahead. And that's when they heard it. The voices, not many, just 3, maybe 4, echoing through the tunnel like broken music. and Jay pulled Corey down behind a pile of old track ballast, heart slamming because he knew those voices, or rather the cadence of them, low and lazy, confident. The sound of men who believed they were alone, and as one of them stepped into view, a shadow in a ragged ball cap with a shotgun slung low and a smile in his voice, Jay felt the pieces click together with sickening precision. Survivors from Randy's crew, or worse, hangers-on. The kind of men who lived in the cracks between law and chaos, hunting opportunity like wolves, and now they were blocking the only way out. 3 figures pacing near a makeshift fire in an old barrel, weapons resting within easy reach, their laughter thin and sharp like glass on pavement. And Jay turned to Corey, whispered low, and the boy nodded, reaching slowly for a broken pipe half buried in dirt. And for a moment, just a moment, Jay saw the boy he used to be, the boy who chased pigeons through broken parking lots and cried when he dropped his first toy. But that boy was gone now, burned away in the fires of South Haven, and in his place stood someone leaner, sharper, someone who understood that survival didn't wait for justice. And so they struck, quick and savage, Jay bursting from the dark with a roar that startled the first man just long enough for the pipe to catch him in the ribs, folding him like a curtain, while Corey swung low and hard at the second, catching him in the knee with enough force to drop him screaming. And the third, the one with the knife, got close, too close, and Jay felt the blade skim his side, felt the blood warm and slick, but he didn't stop, didn't falter, just wrapped his arm around the man's neck and squeezed until the twitching stopped, until the sound of his breath gave out. And then it was over just like that. Silence again, broken only by Corey's breath and the steady drip of blood from Jay's side, and they moved on, stepping over the bodies without hesitation, because the line had been crossed too long ago to even remember, and when they emerged from the tunnel hours later, into the quiet edge of the city where the houses still had mailboxes and the air smelled like cut grass instead of smoke, Jay finally allowed himself to slow, to rest, to lean against a wall and let the weight of the night settle into his bones. And Corey sat beside him, not saying anything, just watching the horizon like it might still hold a future, and maybe it did. Maybe beyond all the sirens and betrayal and flame, there was still a road they could walk together, not as fugitives or ghosts or broken things, but as something else, something new. And Jay didn't dare speak it aloud, but he let himself believe it, if only for a moment, because sometimes belief is the only thing left standing when the world has burned down around ye. The wind was quieter this far north, as if even the air had grown weary of screaming, and as Jay and Corey moved through the sleeping edge of the city, they passed rows of houses that still had light in the windows, and curtains pulled tight. Places where dogs barked not in warning, but in routine, where televisions flickered behind glass like electronic hearths, and it felt surreal to Jay, like he'd crossed a membrane between 2 worlds, one rotting and red with flame, the other ignorant of its neighbor's collapse. And yet even here, even under trimmed hedges and quiet porches, he could smell it. The faint trace of fear in the wind, the kind that traveled ahead of the fire and took root in the spine, and every time a car rolled by, every time a porch light clicked on, Jay's muscles tensed and his eyes tracked exits, because he knew the city didn't forgive this kind of escape. It just waited for you to believe you were free before dragging you back down. And Corey stayed close, his hoodie pulled up, his eyes scanning everything, and Jay saw how the boy moved now, smooth, silent, deliberate, and he hated how necessary that had become, hated how quickly a child could learn to disappear, but he didn't stop him, didn't tell him to walk slower or smile or wave, because those were luxuries they hadn't earned yet. And somewhere deep in Jay's mind was a map, old and frayed, of safe houses and ghost routes, places whispered in bars and holding cells, places people disappeared to when they wanted to die or be reborn, and there was one left, one he hadn't used in years. A construction yard turned squat outside of Cicero, long since condemned but still standing because no one could be bothered to tear it down. And that's where they headed now, skirting side streets and ducking under chain link until the streetlights thinned and the pavement cracked wider, and the city began to sag again. Not with violence this time, but with vacancy, and the yard came into view like something forgotten by time, a skeletal framework of unfinished buildings, overgrown with weeds and littered with pallets, and Jay led Corey through a narrow gap in the fence, stepping over old mattresses and crushed cans, and in the center of the lot stood a trailer, sun-bleached and rust-stained, its windows patched with cardboard, and he knocked once, twice, then waited, and for a long moment nothing moved. Then the door creaked open and a face appeared, thin, hollow-eyed, wrapped in a tattered scarf, and Jay said one word, a name, and the door opened wider, no questions asked, and inside the air was stale and warm, the walls lined with scavenged blankets and piles of unopened cans, and the man who let them in didn't offer a greeting, just pointed to the floor, and they sat, Jay pressing a wad of gauze from a stolen first aid kit to his side, Corey curled against the wall like someone used to corners, and the man, whose name was Roland, didn't speak for a long time, didn't ask what they'd done or who they were running from, because men like Roland had seen too much to need answers, and after a while he placed a map on the floor, old and torn, and traced a path with one shaking finger, a route through the back roads north, where the police presence thinned and the checkpoints hadn't yet been reinforced, and he marked a gas station near the interstate, said a name, just a first name, just enough, and said if they made it that far, someone might be able to get them the rest of the way, and Jay nodded, folded the map, and thanked him, and Roland disappeared back into the dark without another word, and that night they slept in shifts, Jay dreaming with one eye open, Corey twitching in his sleep like he was still fighting something in the smoke. And when the sky turned gray and soft with dawn, they moved again, stealing down roads that looked more like veins than streets, veins pumping them toward freedom or something like it, and the city behind them didn't chase. Not yet, but Jay could feel it watching, like a wounded predator too hurt to run, but still strong enough to kill if provoked. And the world got quieter as they moved. Quieter in a way that didn't feel safe, but empty, and Jay kept his hand close to the blade he'd stolen off the man in the tunnel, because quiet was a trick. And sure enough, by late afternoon, just as they were crossing an overpass above a dried creek bed, the trap snapped shut. 3 figures stepping out from behind a stalled SUV, 2 with guns, one with a grin that reeked of recognition, and Jay froze, pushing Corey behind him, and the man in front, tall, with tattoos climbing his neck, called him by name, said Randy had friends left, said debts didn't vanish just because the boss did, and Jay didn't speak, didn't move, just looked for angles, counted bullets, waited, and then it came. The first twitch, the flinch that comes before a pull, and Jay was already diving, pulling Corey down, rolling across gravel as the first shot cracked the air and punched a hole in the windshield behind them. And then it was chaos again, breathless and loud, but shorter this time, because Jay moved like someone who knew the cost of hesitation, and when it was done, 2 of them were bleeding and 1 was running, and Jay didn't chase him, didn't waste breath, just pulled Corey to his feet and kept moving. And when they finally reached the gas station that night, clothes torn, blood dried to brown, the man behind the counter didn't ask questions when Jay gave the name, just reached under the register and handed him a key. And outside, behind the station, was a battered pickup, full tank, no plates, and a cooler in the back seat with water and bread and a flashlight. And Jay climbed in, Corey beside him, and for a long moment they just sat, listening to the engine purr. The road ahead dark and uncertain but open. And then Jay drove, and the city vanished behind them, swallowed by night. And for the first time in years he didn't know what came next, and he didn't care, because for now they were moving, and that was enough. Who award whatever came next? The road stretched out before them like an unanswered question, long and winding and empty in a way that didn't feel peaceful but hollow. A silence not of calm but of absence. And as the pickup rolled past sleeping barns and rusted silos, Jay kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the rearview mirror, watching for shapes that didn't belong, headlights that moved wrong, the past trying to catch up with them one more time. But so far it was just night and asphalt and the occasional scatter of deer in the distance, and Corey sat beside him, head leaning against the window, eyes half shut, but not quite asleep, because he too had learned that peace was a thing you pretended to feel until it betrayed you, and the cooler between them rattled with every bump, the flashlight sliding slightly with each curve, and Jay didn't speak. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed saying had already been written into the silence between them, and for a while they just drove like that, through towns so small they didn't have names, just faded signs and churches that looked more abandoned than blessed. The kind of places that time forgot or ignored on purpose, and somewhere near the state line they stopped. Not because they had to, but because Jay saw a rest area with broken vending machines and cracked pavement, and something about it felt safe in its desolation. So they pulled over and sat on a picnic bench under a tree that had lost most of its leaves, and Jay unwrapped a sandwich from the cooler and handed half to Corey, who took it without a word, and they ate under a sky full of stars that looked too clean to belong to the same world they'd left behind. And after a while, Jay lit a cigarette he found in the glove box, even though he hadn't smoked in years, and he didn't offer one to Corey, just let the smoke curl into the dark like a prayer that didn't expect to be answered. And finally Corey spoke, soft and slow, asking if this was it, if they were free now. And Jay exhaled, looked down the road, then said, "Maybe." And that was the most truth he could give, because he didn't know, couldn't know. And the next morning they drove again, across county lines and into hills that rolled like old backs, and the trees turned greener and the buildings less charred. And they saw people walking dogs and watering lawns and laughing over coffee like the world hadn't broken just a few miles south. And it made Jay feel strange, like a ghost haunting a world that hadn't realized it was dead yet. And they stopped once for gas, paid cash, kept their heads down, and nobody asked anything because small towns had their own rules, and everyone knew when not to pry, and they kept moving. Northwest now, deeper into the rural stretch where even the maps stopped trying to explain things. And eventually the highway turned to gravel and the gravel to dirt. And that night they found an old cabin, long since empty, its windows boarded and the lock rusted shut. But Jay kicked the door in and found a bed that hadn't collapsed and a fireplace that still worked. And they made a fire from old branches and a torn piece of tarp. And the heat felt real in a way that nothing else had in days. And for the first time since the warehouse, since the blood and the sirens and the fire, Corey laughed. Just once, soft and short, at something stupid Jay said about the smell of the place. And Jay didn't even smile, just held on to the sound like it was the last warm thing left in the world. And that night they slept deep, the wind howling through the cracks in the wood, but nothing came, no one followed. And Jay dreamed not of prison or streets or broken bones, but of silence, clean and soft and endless. And in the morning he woke first, made a weak coffee from what they found in a tin on the shelf, and watched his son sleep. And for once he didn't feel guilt or fear or anger, just a strange stillness, like maybe the worst was finally behind them. And maybe it wasn't, but it didn't matter, because they were far from the fire now, far from the clubs and the cops and the men with knives and promises, and he could breathe again. Not deep, not safe, but real. And as Corey stirred and stretched and blinked against the pale morning light, Jay stood, poured the last of the coffee into a chipped mug, and said they'd move again soon. Not because they were being hunted, but because he didn't know how to sit still anymore. And maybe he never would. And so they packed what little they had, slid back into the pickup, and drove on, through mist-covered valleys and past rivers that shimmered like silver under the sun, and the world didn't welcome them, didn't embrace them, but it didn't fight them either. And for now, that was enough. The road became quieter the further they went, not just in sound but in presence, as if the earth itself was starting to forget people had ever passed this way. The pavement cracked and overgrown, mile markers faded into ghosts of numbers, telephone poles leaning like tired sentinels left behind by time, and Jay drove through it all with both hands on the wheel and a stillness in his chest that didn't come from peace but from fatigue deeper than bone, the kind of exhaustion that numbs not just the body but the soul. And Corey beside him didn't talk much anymore, only asked occasional questions like, "How far?" Or, "Are we close?" And Jay never really had answers, only guesses, only half maps drawn in memory and stitched together from rumors and overheard names, and one of those names had come back to him the night before, when he couldn't sleep in the cabin and sat watching the fire collapse into embers, a name whispered years ago in a holding cell by a man with broken teeth and a tattoo that wrapped around his neck like ivy, Maggie Dean, someone who knew how to vanish people, not just hide them, but erase them. Take their names and give them new ones. Take their faces and blur them until no one could find them again. And Maggie was supposed to be dead or missing or retired, depending on who you asked. But Jay had a feeling, the kind that lived in the marrow, that she wasn't far from here, not anymore. And the roads began to change again, hills giving way to thick woods, the trees growing close and tall, the sky thinning above like light trying to press through grief, and eventually they reached a turnoff, unmarked. The kind you miss unless you're looking for something specific. And Jay took it without hesitation, gravel crunching under the wheels as branches scraped the side of the truck like fingernails, and after a while the trees parted to reveal a clearing, and in that clearing stood a house that wasn't quite a house, more like a stitched-together patchwork of cabins, trailers, sheds, all painted the same dull color of wood long since forgotten by rain. And Jay stopped the truck, stepped out, and told Corey to stay inside. And as he walked toward the crooked porch, the door opened before he could knock, and a woman stepped out. Tall, lean, hair like steel wool, and eyes sharp enough to cut silence. And she looked at him without blinking, and said his name, not like a question, but like a sentence. And Jay nodded, didn't ask how she knew he was coming because people like Maggie always knew, always had someone watching the roads, the gas stations, the faces on the back pages, and she stepped aside and let him in, not out of kindness but calculation. And the inside of her home was cluttered with paper, old tech, maps that looked older than him, piles of IDs and passports and burner phones and hard drives, and she moved through it all like a spider across its web, every item a thread she could pull at any time. And they didn't speak much, just enough for him to say what he needed and for her to understand what it would cost. And when she finally looked him in the eye, really looked, she didn't see a man asking to disappear. She saw a father asking to save his son, and that was different. That carried a price you couldn't put on paper, and maybe that's why she didn't quote a number, didn't demand favors or blood, just nodded slowly and said she'd start the process. And Jay left her to it, stepped outside and sat on the hood of the truck, watching Corey kick rocks into the grass, his movements loose and slow, like someone remembering how to be a kid but unsure if it was allowed. And Jay didn't interrupt, didn't speak, just watched the way the sun fell through the trees and wondered if this was what peace looked like when it wasn't clean, when it was earned through ashen blood. And the next day Maggie called them back in and handed Jay a folder. Inside were 2 new identities: clean, quiet, forgettable, new names, new birthdays, school records for Corey, a work license for Jay, everything they would need to be someone else, somewhere else. And it hit him harder than he expected, because a part of him realized that this was it, the last page of the old life turning to ash, and he felt it catch in his throat. Not grief, not loss, but something heavier, something like guilt laced with hope. And Corey opened his file and said his new name out loud, testing the syllables like stones in his mouth. And Jay watched him, nodded slowly, and repeated his own. And it sounded strange, not wrong, just unsteady, like a bridge that hadn't been crossed yet. And Maggie told them where to go, a town upstate, quiet, full of working people who didn't ask questions and didn't talk to police. A place where ghosts could pass as gardeners and no one cared what your name used to be. And Jay thanked her with more sincerity than he'd ever shown anyone outside of prison. And she just shrugged, lit a cigarette, and told him not to waste it because second lives were harder to live than first ones. And he understood what she meant. Deeply, completely. And the next morning they left before sunrise, the truck loaded with new clothes, new IDs, a new story that didn't include silver, or guns, or flames. And as they turned back onto the main road, the trees seemed to open up just a little, the sun reaching through like fingers. And Jay looked at Corey and said the new name again, just to make it real. And Corey didn't smile, but he nodded, and Jay turned the wheel north, the forest falling behind them. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a fugitive. He felt like a father driving his son to school, and it hurt more than anything. They reached the town before noon, a speck on the map with a name so ordinary it felt made up. The kind of place where no one locked their doors because no one ever came, where the biggest noise on a weekday was a garbage truck backing down a hill, or a dog barking at a squirrel, and the roads were smooth, the storefronts still hand-painted, and the people glanced at them not with suspicion but with that small-town habit of cataloging strangers, in case they stayed long enough to matter. And Jay kept his sunglasses on as he pulled the truck into the gas station just off Main. Not out of paranoia, but instinct, because even with a new name in his wallet and a clean address waiting in his glove box, his body still remembered how it felt to be hunted. And beside him, Corey sat still, eyes wide but quiet, taking in the sidewalks, the slow-moving cars, the high school kids hanging around a sandwich shop like nothing in the world could touch them. And Jay saw something flicker behind his son's eyes. Maybe envy, maybe confusion. But it passed, replaced by the same measured calm he'd worn since South Haven burned. And when they stepped out of the truck, the town smelled of dry pine and pavement warming under a bright sky, and it felt unreal, like a dream they'd stumbled into by accident. And they found the rental house at the end of a short cul-de-sac that curled around itself like a sleeping animal. A little single-story place with white siding and a front yard barely big enough for a chair. And Jay unlocked the door with the key Maggie had given them, stepping inside to find everything exactly as promised. Clean floors, second-hand furniture, a refrigerator humming in a kitchen smaller than most closets. And he walked through the space slowly, each footstep echoing just a bit too loudly, while Corey wandered toward the hallway, checking rooms with a kind of caution that didn't belong to a kid his age. And when he chose one, he didn't say a word, just dropped his backpack onto the bed and sat down, staring at the wall like he was waiting for something to fall through it. And Jay watched him for a moment before turning away, unpacking the duffel bag one item at a time, stacking clothes in drawers, lining toothbrushes on the sink, performing the rituals of normal life like an actor rehearsing a scene, and that night they ate microwaved dinners and watched a muted TV sitcom neither of them understood. The laughter track strange and mechanical, and afterward, Corey fell asleep on the couch with a book he hadn't finished, and Jay stood by the window for a long time, staring out into the quiet street, unsure whether the stillness outside was a gift or a threat. And the days that followed passed like pages flipping in the wind, unmarked, light, surreal. Jay found work at an auto shop on the edge of town, cash under the table for now, just enough to keep moving. And Corey started school the next Monday, backpack slung over his shoulder, new name printed clean on his student ID. And when Jay watched him walk through the doors, he wanted to scream, not from fear, but from the staggering weight of hope. Because he'd dragged this boy through fire, and now he was asking him to pretend it never happened. And each afternoon Corey came home a little quieter, a little more withdrawn, and Jay didn't press, just waited, cooked, listened. And it wasn't until the third week that the silence broke, just once, when Corey sat down at the table, picked at his dinner, and said there was a kid at school who talked too much about guns. And Jay felt his stomach drop, but didn't react. Just nodded, asked if the kid seemed dangerous. And Corey shrugged, said no, just loud, just stupid, and Jay let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And in the nights that followed, the quiet began to soften, not disappear but settle, and Jay started walking to work without checking over his shoulder, started talking to the cashier at the grocery store, started sleeping more than 4 hours at a time, and Corey brought home books, sketches, even a report card tucked deep in his backpack with grades better than Jay expected. And one night they played cards at the kitchen table while music played low on the radio. And Jay realized he hadn't heard sirens in weeks, hadn't seen police tape or boarded windows or boys with bricks in their hands. And that scared him more than anything because peace was the most dangerous thing for a man like him. The thing that made you believe you were safe, just long enough to be wrong. But still, he let himself believe it. A little more each day, and the old scars stopped aching so much, and the silence in the house began to feel earned rather than imposed. And then one afternoon, just before sunset, Jay saw a car parked across the street, ordinary, beige, unmarked, and the driver didn't get out. Didn't look over, just sat, and Jay watched from behind the curtain, heart pounding. And after 15 minutes the car pulled away, slow, careful, and Jay stood still for a long time, until Corey came home with a new scrape on his hand and a story about climbing the fence behind the school. And Jay nodded, made dinner, and didn't say a word about the car, didn't check the locks more than usual, didn't move money or burn documents, just waited and watched, and told himself that sometimes a car is just a car. But deep down he knew the past wasn't done with them yet. It had just changed its face. Weeks passed like rain slipping through a cracked gutter. Quiet at first, almost invisible, but always gathering, always moving toward something heavier. And Jay knew the signs. The way stillness grew taut. The way the birds stopped landing near the house. The way the town's smiles turned just a little too polite, as if they'd begun to guess something wasn't quite right. And though nothing had happened, no knock at the door, no name said aloud, no badge flashed beneath a jacket, Jay felt the weight behind the calm, like breath being held. And it wasn't paranoia, not the fevered kind that whispers shadows into every corner, but the steady, practiced vigilance of a man who's lived through the knock that does come, who knows better than to believe in luck or mercy. And Corey, meanwhile, was adapting with the eerie precision of someone who had no choice but to survive, slipping into this new version of himself with quiet efficiency, waking early, doing his schoolwork, answering questions with just enough personality to pass, but never enough to reveal anything real. And Jay watched him the way a soldier watches a teammate in the field, carefully, constantly, measuring for cracks, But Corey held together, stronger than Jay could have imagined. And yet, that strength made it worse. Because Jay saw what it cost, how the boy never fully relaxed, how every loud bang outside made him flinch just a little, how he never let his back rest against an open window. And every time Jay caught those small things, he felt the knife twist again, that endless guilt, sharp and steady, and still they tried to live. Jay fixing cars during the day, drinking weak coffee in the break room, with men who talked about deer season and engine parts and whose eyes never quite settled on his face too long, and Corey going to school, bringing home books, and once, for the first time, a photo of himself with 2 kids from his class, laughing, mouths wide, blurred slightly like proof of something good trying to survive, and Jay kept that photo in a drawer, looked at it when he couldn't sleep, told himself it meant something real. And then came the fire, not theirs, not yet, but someone else's. A trailer outside town gone up in the middle of the night. No explanation, no injuries, just black smoke twisting into the sky like a warning flare. And the way people talked about it made Jay's spine stiffen, because there was no fear in their voices, only curiosity, only that strange fascination people feel when they watch something burn that doesn't belong to them. And he remembered how South Haven had started to crack, how the heat had built slow at first, then all at once, and he saw it now in the way the sheriff's car lingered near the auto shop longer than usual, in the way the school sent a letter home about emergency preparedness, in the way Corey came home quiet one afternoon, dropped his backpack on the table, and said a man had asked him his name in the parking lot. Not a teacher, not a parent, just someone standing near a dark car who smiled too long and left too quickly. And Jay didn't panic, didn't yell, just asked the right questions, kept his voice low, wrote down the car's description. And that night, he cleaned the truck, checked the fuel, tested the emergency stash Maggie had given him, and for a while he sat outside on the porch, smoking slowly, eyes fixed on the woods beyond the cul-de-sac. And when Corey joined him, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they'd already said it all without words 100 times before. And the next morning, Jay walked Corey to school, not close, just a block behind, watching, measuring the distance between light and danger. And when Corey turned the corner into the schoolyard, Jay saw the car again, parked near a mailbox, engine running, and he didn't move toward it, didn't confront it, just watched the driver, a man with sunglasses too dark for the weather sitting too still. And when the car pulled away, Jay memorized the plate, then walked back home the long way, circling, checking mirrors, making sure they weren't being followed. And that afternoon he called Barry, the line static heavy, brief but enough. And Barry didn't ask questions, just said one thing. If they've found you, it's not just a warning, it's a clock. And Jay knew what that meant, knew that time wasn't just running, it was being counted down. And that night he took Corey aside, laid out the documents again, the bags, the plans. And for the first time, the boy didn't protest, didn't argue, just nodded, eyes steady, and said, "Okay," and they agreed on a signal, agreed on what to grab first, agreed on where to meet if they were split up, and Jay didn't sleep at all that night, not even for a minute, because the storm wasn't on the horizon anymore. It was here, slow and invisible, but closer than breath. And all they could do now was be ready, not for victory, not for safety, but for the moment when everything broke again, because it would. And when it did, they wouldn't run. They'd move, they'd vanish, they'd survive. The storm didn't come with thunder or flashing lights. No dramatic chase through moonlit backroads. No last-second dash through shadows with sirens at their heels. It came quietly, exactly how Jay had always feared it would. Not as an eruption, but a slow, surgical dismantling. the kind of precision strike designed not just to catch you but to make you doubt you'd ever really escaped at all. And it began on a Tuesday, the most ordinary day, cloudless and dull, with Jay under the hood of a pickup at the shop, grease on his palms, the radio low in the background, when the foreman came out of the office with that careful expression people wear when they're about to ruin something, and said there'd been a call from someone official sounding, asking too many questions about a new mechanic with no references. And Jay didn't say anything, didn't react, just nodded, wiped his hands, and walked out the back without finishing the job because he didn't need to ask what kind of questions they were, didn't need to wait for the next call, and by the time he reached the house he already knew they had hours, not days. And inside Corey was at the kitchen table, sketching something on lined paper. And Jay stopped in the doorway and looked at him. Really looked. At the long sleeves pulled over his wrists. At the way his shoulders no longer flinched when the door opened. And for a moment the weight of everything they'd carried almost brought him to his knees, because there was no version of this ending that wouldn't scar them both. And he wanted to say something then, to tell the boy how proud he was, how sorry, how much he'd tried. But all that came out was his name, Corey. And the boy looked up, and whatever he saw on Jay's face made him stand without asking a single question, just walked to the hall closet, grabbed the backpack they'd packed and unpacked and repacked a dozen times, checked the contents out of instinct, then zipped it shut. And by the time Jay had the truck loaded, the sky had begun to turn. Not with weather, but with tension, the kind of pressure you feel more than see. And they drove without music, without talk, past the edge of town and onto the back roads Maggie had marked years ago. And it all felt rehearsed because it was. Every step, a memory they'd kept fresh like a wound. And 2 hours north they stopped at a gas station with flickering lights and a clerk who didn't look up from his phone, and Jay bought 2 coffees and used the burner phone to dial the number Maggie had written on the bottom of the envelope marked Final. And it rang twice, then clicked, and a voice that wasn't hers gave him a new address, a new route, and told him to burn the note when he was done. And he did, standing in the gravel beside the truck, the flame small and hungry in his palm before the wind snatched it away, and they kept moving, each mile sharpening the edge inside him, because this wasn't just escape anymore. This was extraction. This was severance. And when they reached the next checkpoint, a dark farmhouse half buried by pine trees, a woman stepped out with a tablet and eyes that didn't blink, and she scanned their faces, then nodded and pointed to a different truck. Keys already in the ignition, and Jay helped Corey climb in. And they didn't look back at the vehicle that had carried them so far, because looking back now meant inviting grief. And grief was a weakness they couldn't afford. And the new truck smelled of dust and diesel. And the road they were on didn't exist on any GPS, and the trees closed in like walls. And still they drove, until the woods opened up again into flat farmland, golden in the late sun, and ahead of them was a barn, long and low, a concrete building beside it with a sliding metal door, and inside was the plane. Not a jet, not military, just a single-prop bird with faded paint and empty seats. But Jay had flown worse, trusted less, and when the man beside the plane waved them forward, they knew this was it. Not the end, but the last crossing, the last leap. And Jay turned to Corey, who sat with his hands folded, eyes distant, and he wanted to say something, wanted to offer closure or comfort or a clean lie about everything being better now. But the boy just looked at him and said, "I'm ready." And it wasn't brave or cold, it was true, and Jay nodded, swallowed whatever else he might have said, and together they climbed into the plane, strapped in, waited, and the engine started with a reluctant roar. And as the wheels lifted off the cracked tarmac, Jay looked down at the ground falling away, the barn shrinking, the trees blurring into shadow, and he felt something release inside him, Not relief exactly, but surrender. The kind that comes when you've run every mile, crossed every line, paid every price, and there's nothing left but air and silence. And Corey sat beside him, eyes forward. And Jay reached over, placed a hand on his shoulder. And in that moment, with the sky opening around them and the ground finally behind them, he didn't feel like a fugitive or a criminal or a man escaping justice. He felt like a father, and that was enough. Because this wasn't about freedom anymore, or forgiveness, or even survival. It was about making sure the boy next to him never had to live with fire in his lungs again. And as the clouds swallowed them whole and the world below disappeared, Jay closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, he dreamed not of prison or ash or blood, but of peace, quiet, fragile, possible.